Welcome to the Philosophy of Today. I'm Jim Hammond. As I mentioned in an earlier video, Arthur Conan Doyle, who was famous for the Sherlock Holmes stories, he had a keen interest in the occult, and he gave lectures on the occult. And one of the people who heard him lecture was J.B. Rhine. Rhine started the Rhine Research Center at Duke, which was originally part of Duke and then was separated from the university. Rhine conducted experiments at the Rhine Research Center, and one of the people that was impressed with his experiments was Jung. Jung felt that Rhine had proven the existence of occult phenomena or extrasensory perception. Let's pretend I have a pack of cards. I shuffle the cards, I turn over the top card, and somebody in the next room tries to guess what card I've turned over. According to probability, about 2% of the time he would guess correctly. Let's pretend he guesses 5% correct. So that would be about double probability. That raises the question, is he seeing the card that I turn over through some sort of extrasensory perception, or is he reading my mind as I'm turning over the card? In other words, is this ESP or telepathy? A lot of occult phenomena raise this very question: which category of the occult does it belong in? Because the different categories tend to overlap, and it's often difficult to assign an occult phenomenon to a specific category of the occult. For example, if somebody anticipates that they're going to die in a car accident a week from now, and they do in fact die in a car accident a week from now, it raises the question, are they anticipating the future? Is this some sort of prophecy? Or is it a case of mind over matter, mind over circumstances? Are they molding the future with the power of the mind? So is it a case of anticipating the future or creating the future through the power of the mind? When Van Gogh was 30 years old, he predicted that he would be dead in 6 to 10 years, and in fact he died at 37. So is this a prophecy, or is this a example of how the mind can create circumstances, create events in the external world? I suppose since Van Gogh committed suicide, people would say that this is a case of mind over circumstances. But I think it's a fair question which category of the occult this kind of thing falls into. And this is not at all unusual. The poet John Keats had the same feeling that he would die young, Soren Kierkegaard, etc. So this is a common thing where people anticipate how long they have to live, and they anticipate when they're going to die. So it raises the question, which category of the occult does this belong in? Is it an anticipation of the future, or is it a mind over circumstances? Is it the power of the mind to shape the external world? So let's go back to J.B. Rhine's experiments at the Rhine Research Center. Let's pretend that he's working with somebody who makes 100 attempts to guess the card every day for 2 weeks. And he starts off guessing 5%, which would be double probability. But as the days go on, his performance declines, and at the end of the 2 weeks, he's down to 2%. He's right at probability. This is the kind of experiment that Rhine conducted, and this is the kind of result that he got. He discovered that people's performance tended to decline over time. So why is that? Well, I think that psychic ability depends on enthusiasm, excitement. When enthusiasm declines, the psychic performance declines. If the same experiment is performed over and over, day after day, it becomes routine, it becomes boring, it no longer stirs people up and gets them excited. And so they don't have that psychic ability that they had at the beginning. So that's why in ancient Greece and Rome, if they consulted prophets about what was going to happen in the future, the prophet would always try to reach a state of excitement. He would always try to work himself up into a state of enthusiasm or excitement. By the way, the word enthusiasm comes from theos, meaning God, and enthusiasm means having the God within. You're possessed, in a sense, by some sort of inner voice or God, or you might call it the unconscious. So how did the ancient prophets reach this state of enthusiasm or frenzy? One way would be by music and dance. Another would be by breathing certain gases. I know the oracle at Delphi in Greece, which was the most famous oracle in Greece, had certain gases coming out of the ground. And there was a team of scientists that went to Delphi about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and they tested the ground, and they discovered that there were indeed special gases coming out of the ground at that point, which could produce a kind of high or a kind of excitement in the prophet at Delphi. One facet of life where people are often excited and enthusiastic is sports. And so what I find is that there's a lot of occult phenomena in the world of sports. One of the famous examples from baseball is when Babe Ruth had his so-called called shot, where he pointed to the stands and then proceeded to hit a home run in those very stands on the next pitch. So it's almost as if he anticipated what was going to happen. Again, we have the question that we posed before: is this an anticipation of the future, or is it a case of mind over circumstances, mind over matter? Perhaps one of the jobs of a coach is to get his players excited and enthused and passionate so that they can perform at a higher level than they could in a calm state. So the coach's job is to get the players charged up, so to speak. Another facet of life that produces this state of excitement is war. What I find is that soldiers often anticipate whether they'll be killed or not, when they'll be killed. For example, the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, he was the famous World War I ace for Germany. He died at age 25. He was shot down by a Canadian or something. There's quite a mystery, actually, about how he died. But anyway, what I find interesting about the Red Baron is that after shooting down about 80 enemy planes, he called his family together and said, "I feel that my end has come, the end is near." And sure enough, he was shot down soon afterwards. So he seemed to anticipate when he would die, and he told his family, his friends, this is what's going to happen, and this is what I want you to do about it. It's almost as if he were writing his will, in a sense, because he knew that his time was up. Another example of the same sort of thing is a Rhode Island soldier named Sullivan Ballou, who's famous now because he figures in the documentary on the Civil War. He wrote a letter to his wife before the first Battle of Bull Run and said, "If I die, here's what you should do." Now, the letter doesn't seem to leave much doubt that he's going to die. And sure enough, he did die. But the interesting thing is that the casualties for a Northern soldier in the first Battle of Bull Run, probably 5%, at the most 10%. So how did he know that he'd be one of the 5% or the 10%? I think it's an anticipation of the future, or possibly, as I said before, some sort of case of the mind molding the external world. So people talk a lot about that letter that was written by Sullivan Ballou. It's a very eloquent, very moving letter, and it plays a very prominent role in the Ken Burns documentary. But I never heard anybody say, how did this guy know he was going to die? Because it seems, when you look at that letter, that he anticipated he was going to die. But I think it's a real question, how did he know that his time had come? Dean Radin, whom I discussed last time, he describes an experiment with an RNG, in other words, a random number generator. The RNG produces random numbers, either ones or zeros, and over an extended period of time, we would expect it to produce about 50% ones, 50% zeros. So he asked somebody to sit next to the RNG, think about the number 1, 1, 1, and sure enough, that had the effect of skewing the machine so that it produced more ones than zeros. So what Dean Radin tried to prove is that the mind is able to influence a machine to make it produce numbers that it would not otherwise produce. So I think if the RNG is able to come up with that kind of a result, it raises the question, is everything connected? Is everything alive? And those are the two principles that I've been trying to get across in all these videos, is everything is connected, everything is alive. Those are, in my view, the two basic principles of what I would call the philosophy of today. So if the mind is able to influence the machine and make it produce more ones than it otherwise would, I think it shows a connection between things, and it shows that the machine is in some sense alive, because otherwise how could it respond to the human mind? How could it be influenced by the human mind if it was just purely a mechanical thing? And when we talked about quantum physics, we saw how particles, which are obviously not living things, seem to respond to other particles almost as if they were alive. So I would say that if somebody sat next to that RNG and it was able to produce more ones than zeros, if you keep him in that chair for 2 hours a day, every day for 2 weeks, it gets boring and his performance would probably decline. So I think any sort of experiment on the occult has to take into account that psychic phenomena require a certain amount of excitement or enthusiasm. So I would say that J.B. Rhine's experiments with cards and other things are, in my view, somewhat boring. And even if they're convincing, as Jung felt they were, they're not that interesting to perform, in my view, or to read about. They don't make great literature, let's put it that way. I would say Dean Radin's experiments are more interesting, more varied, really quite worth reading about if you haven't read about that sort of thing. But even with Dean Radin, I personally find the occult phenomena in the world around us to be more interesting than in the laboratory. So, for example, what the Red Baron said about his imminent death, that sort of thing is what interests me more than the laboratory environment. So I don't read many books about the occult. I find the occult in books about other subjects. For example, even a book on the history of railroads or business or the stock market, the human body, memoirs of a doctor, even if it's written by a person who doesn't believe in the occult, thinks it's a lot of nonsense, it still has these anecdotes or stories that, in my view, are very convincing and very interesting examples of the occult. In an earlier video, I said that the Zen revolution, the Eastern revolution, was anticipated by Thoreau and Walter Pater and Walt Whitman. I also said that the psychology revolution, the Freud-Jung revolution, was anticipated by Nietzsche. If the occult becomes important in philosophy and in intellectual life generally, who should get credit for anticipating this revolution? I would say that the two people that should get credit are Schopenhauer and Poe, who both were writing around 1820. Schopenhauer had a keen interest in mesmerism, which might be described as a relative of hypnosis. Mesmerism is also known as animal magnetism. The founder of mesmerism, Franz Mesmer, he coined the term animal magnetism, meaning a force or energy exerted by living things and perhaps non-living things too. Schopenhauer, who was generally receptive to the occult, said, considered from the philosophical point of view, animal magnetism is the most pregnant of all discoveries that have ever been made, although for the time being it propounds rather than solves riddles. It is really practical metaphysics. A time will come when philosophy, animal magnetism, and natural science will shed so bright a light on one another that truths will be discovered at which we could not otherwise hope to arrive. So what he's talking about is what I've been doing in these videos. He's talking about combining philosophy, occult phenomena, and science. I try to bring in philosophy like Renaissance Italian philosophy, Hermetic philosophy. I try to bring in science in the form of quantum physics. So he's talking about a synthesis exactly like I've been trying to develop here. And when he talks about the most pregnant of all discoveries that have ever been made, that's a very strong phrase. And I think it deserves that sort of strong phrase. Now, when he talks about propounding riddles rather than solving them, that's sort of what I mean when I say that we're surrounded by mysteries. The occult is a great mystery. We don't have a lot of certain knowledge. We have a lot of questions, and we have very little certain knowledge. So I would agree with Schopenhauer that the occult raises a lot of questions. It doesn't give us indisputable answers, which is precisely why it deserves more consideration, more thought, more experiments, etc. And Edgar Allan Poe shared Schopenhauer's view that mesmerism opened up important new fields. Poe said, "The soul of the man of today is upon the verge of some stupendous psychical discoveries." We would not use the word cycle. We might speak of psychic or psychical or psychological, but obviously we can see where he's going with this. He thinks, as Schopenhauer did, that occult phenomena open up a whole new universe of intellectual inquiry. In addition to Schopenhauer and Poe, Jung also anticipated the occult revolution, although he might be considered an example of this revolution rather than an anticipator of it. Jung noted that occult phenomena indicate that the unconscious can leap over space and time, that someone in New York can sense what's happening in Los Angeles, that we can sense on Monday what's going to happen on Tuesday. Jung said, "I predicted the Nazi rising in Germany through the observation of my German patients. They had dreams in which the whole thing was anticipated and in considerable detail." Jung said, "Nobody can say where man ends. That is the beauty of it, you know. It's very interesting. The unconscious of man can reach God knows where. There we are going to make discoveries." So again, he's thinking, as Schopenhauer and Poe did, that we're on the verge of some enormous revolutions in the intellectual sphere. The entire life of the mind is going to be profoundly affected by what might be called the occult revolution. Notice Jung's emphasis on how beautiful it is, how interesting it is. This is the same point I tried to make before when I said that the occult is a great subject for novelists, filmmakers, all sorts of artists. It makes life richer, more interesting. Freud said he was puzzled throughout his life by two issues, the occult and the identity of Shakespeare. I organized a discussion group at Books on the Square in Wayland Square, Providence. For 10 years, we met about once a month. And these were the two issues that we discussed most frequently, the occult and the identity of Shakespeare. We kept coming back to these two questions. Ironically, these are the very subjects that academia regards as not only uninteresting, but completely out of bounds. A young academic who discussed either of these subjects would ruin his career. Freud eventually felt that Shakespeare was the pen name of the Earl of Oxford. So in that sense, you could say that Freud eventually achieved a kind of clarity or resolution on the question of the identity of Shakespeare. As for the occult, I think he gradually became more receptive to the occult, and he gradually accepted that certain parts of the occult were valid, such as telepathy. Freud said that if he were young and he was just starting out on his career, he might choose the occult as his specialty, because he realized it was a very fertile field, a field full of mysteries, full of work to be done, so to speak. it was like a continent that had just been discovered and was completely unexplored. You might say the occult is the largest unexplored continent in the intellectual world. Freud had disciples scattered around the Western world, and he had a disciple in England named Ernest Jones, who was a very rational thinker, and he warned Freud to stay away from the occult because if you accept any part of it, then you'll be drawn into accepting more and more. For example, telepathy, which seems to be the part of the occult that people can see most readily in the everyday world. He said telepathy would be the thin edge of the wedge. In other words, once you accept that, then you're drawn into accepting the occult in its entirety. So Jones warned Freud to stay away from everything related to the occult. Telepathy, such as we find between twins or between a mother and child, might be called level 1 occult. Level 2 occult would be the sort of synchronicity that Shakespeare depicts. Animals behaving strangely, meteors behaving strangely, weather behaving strangely. The animals in Shakespeare aren't pets in some sort of rapport with the owner. They aren't in a relationship with a person. They're like the birds that ancient soothsayers observed. In other words, they're part of nature, and they seem to behave in a way that is related to the human sphere. Level 2 occult, such as Shakespeare depicts, is harder for people to accept than level 1. Level 3 occult would be apparently random acts that have a connection to man, such as tarot cards or dice. For example, in the Chinese classic, the I Ching, you can use the roll of dice to understand what's going on in the human sphere. Jung had great respect for the I Ching. He said the I Ching was never wrong. He consulted it on a number of occasions. But it's obviously very hard for people to accept that something random like the roll of the dice could have a connection to human destiny, human personality, the future, etc. It could actually give advice to us that's valuable advice. Obviously, a lot of people will dismiss it out of hand without trying it. Jung tried it, and he found it to be full of wisdom. So how could it possibly be that the roll of dice could be connected to human destiny? Well, if we accept those two principles that I mentioned before, that everything is connected and everything is alive, then even a random event such as the roll of dice could conceivably have a connection to human destiny. Let's go back to what I called the level 2 occult, in other words, the weather, the flight of birds, meteors, etc., which seem to foretell future events or harmonize with current events. Such things seem to indicate an intelligence in the universe, and some people may believe that they indicate the existence of an intelligent being, a God who is orchestrating these events, giving signs to mankind, communicating with man by a kind of sign language. Some Greeks and Romans thought that the practice of divination, which means reading the signs and foretelling the future, the practice of divination is a proof that gods exist. And indeed, the word divination comes from divas, meaning God. So foretelling the future is the same as communicating with the gods. So there was a feeling among certain ancients that the practice of divination, if indeed it's valid, if it really is happening, then it's a proof that God exists. I would say that intelligence is in nature itself, not in a being separate from nature. Whether we use the word God or the word nature is a choice, a matter of taste. I prefer not to use the word God because it has all sorts of baggage, all sorts of anthropomorphic baggage. So I prefer to speak of intelligent nature or intelligent universe rather than intelligent being. But the occult often comes close to and overlaps with religion, as in this case of divination, and as in the case of life after death, which is an important part of religion and also an important part of the occult. The occult and religion both deal with the invisible, the intangible, and they both seem strange and foreign to scientists who prefer to stick to the material world and don't believe in the spiritual, the invisible. As for life after death, I think it's likely. I think the evidence for it is quite abundant and quite persuasive, and this is my attitude toward many aspects of the occult. I'm receptive. I think it's likely. I think it deserves further inquiry, but I don't claim to have certain knowledge. When I heard Dean Radin speak in Providence, I asked him what he thought of psychics like John Edward, who appear to communicate with the dead. Radin said, "It's clear that Edward is not a fraud, but it isn't clear whether he's communicating with the dead or reading the minds of people in the audience." As I mentioned before, different branches of the occult often overlap, and it's difficult to assign an occult phenomenon to a particular branch. I'd like to close with a quote from an English scientist named Humphrey Davy. "Nothing is so fatal to the progress of the human mind as to suppose our views of science are ultimate, that there are no mysteries in nature, that our triumphs are complete, and that there are no new worlds to conquer." It seems to me that this is a justification for inquiring into occult phenomena, because the occult is where there's the greatest amount of mysteries, the greatest amount of unknowns, and I think that inquiry into the occult is not a unscientific activity. It's actually the essence of science, is to explore mystery and explore anomalies. So I don't see any tension between magical thinking and scientific thinking. I think that a genuine scientist is going to explore the occult and explore magic. By the way, if you want to give any feedback on the show, we have an email address, which is today@ljhammond.com, and there's a website, ljhammond.com/today. If you go to that website, you'll get more information about the people that we're discussing. So that's all for today, and thank you for watching.